Hi, everybody, and welcome to TGCS. My name is Tim Gallagher, and today we are going to be discussing AP Computer Science A, topic 4.6, using text files. And in this video, we'll discuss reading values from a text file, specifically a CSV file, and we'll also explore how to use the string method split to break up our data into usable parts. All right, let's get started. So here I have a lot of information on the screen. This is actually a data set. We talked about data sets in an earlier video. This is one that I got off of Kaggle.com, and it represents the top colleges in 2022. Now, a couple of disclaimers here. I don't know where this data came from. There's lots of organizations that put out ranks for colleges. This one didn't have any source information. So for all I know, someone could have made up all of these rankings. So it's always good to verify your data if you're going to use it for any type of research or anything. Also, I had to edit this data a lot. We talked about cleaning or trimming data. There was a lot of extra information in here as well. But you can notice at the top of the first line of that data are all of my headings, right? So I have rank, organization name, state, campus setting, website, phone number, etc. And then it has all of the institutions listed below that. All of my information is separated by commas. This is a CSV file. So all of my elements are separated by our commas. Now, what I want to do with this data is I want to create a class that can hold objects for each one of these colleges. So I'm going to create a college class. Now, based on the column headings that we had, our colleges have these attributes in the data set. You can see all those are 16 different attributes that we're going to have for our college objects. Now, how could we represent those in our college class? Well, they're going to be instance variables, right? So here's the beginning of a class I have started called college. And notice I have instance variables for each one of the elements that are in my data file. So there's a large amount of information that I'm tracking here. Also, I've got a constructor with 16 parameters that initialize my 16 instance variables. And then also in the class, I'm going to have my accessor methods. Here's 8 accessor methods that just return the instance variable values. And here are some more accessor methods as well, again, that just return the values of my instance variables. And then finally, I've got a toString method here, which formats my information a little nicer. That gives me all of the 16 instance variables all concatenated together in one string. Notice the \n that I'm using to get new lines as well. Okay, so that's the class that I want to create, or that I have created, that I want to load my information into from the file. So let's talk about using these text files. Now, a file is a storage for a data set, and it exists even when the program is not running. So this would be a good way to save information that can be used later, even when your program's not running or your computer's off. This is often referred to, this method that we're going to talk about, as file input output, or file IO for short. So now we're going to use file IO to load the Top Colleges 2022 edited file into our program. And we're going to do that using the file and the scanner classes to allow our program to connect and read that data. Now, these two classes exist on your Java Quick Reference sheet as part of the AP Computer Science A exam, but let's look at these classes here. First of all, there's a file class, and the file class has a constructor that accepts a string path name as a parameter and constructs a file object in our program. The scanner class has a constructor that accepts a file object, and then it allows us to read now from that file. What we're going to do is we're going to look in that file, and as long as there are next lines to be read, it's going to return, this method has next is going to return true. We want to make sure we don't go past the end of the file. So before we read any data from our data file, we're going to make sure that there are next lines to be read. Now, these other methods of the scanner class, such as next int, next double, and next boolean, you might have used these earlier if you were reading from keyboard input with some of your earlier programs. You could also use these with files to read integers, doubles, and booleans from there. We're not going to use them in this video here, but we're going to use the next line method. And this gets an entire line of text as one string, and this is how our data is stored, right? All of our information for each institution is stored on a line within that data file. So we want to read the entire line from that data file one at a time and then process that string. Finally, there's a close method. Always a good idea to close the scanner after you're done reading from the file. All right, let's look at a code example. So here I've got a program called College Tester One that has a main method, and this is going to load up the information from our file into our Java program. So let's look at this individually. First, I've got three imports. I'm importing the file class and the scanner class, and I'm also importing something called a IO exception, which we'll talk about in a moment. Make sure that you're importing the correct files, the correct classes from the Java library to go ahead and make sure that you have access to these classes so you can create these objects. Next, you'll notice at the end of my main, we have something different here. We have a throws IO exception. And because we're using file IO in this program, we'll need to add throws IO exception to our method headers because there's a possibility that this type of exception might get thrown. And we're really not going to handle it here. That's beyond the scope of this course. There are ways of handling and recovering from exceptions, but that's not something that we're going to cover here in AP Computer Science A. So just know that we have to have throws IO exception whenever we're doing IO functions. Okay, now I've created a file called college file, which is new file. And this is where I put in the parameter, the name of the .csv file that I'm using. Now the file does need to be in the same folder as your program, or you can specify a full path or web address or some other way that your IDE might be reading that file into your Java program. Then I create a scanner object. I'm calling it input. You may have done this before if you were reading keyboard input, but notice in the constructor, I'm sending it the file object that I called college file. So now scanner knows to read from that file. So here I'm going to do input, which is the name of my scanner, and then next line. Now notice next line gives me the line of text from that file, but I'm not actually capturing that here because what's that first line in my data file? It's the column headers. I really don't care about the column headers here, right? All I care about is the data below that. So I'm just going to call input dot next line so that it reads the header and gets that out of the way. Now let's look at our data and reading our file one line at a time. So the first thing I'm going to do is say input dot has next. While there are more lines to read, okay, now I can go ahead and read this. And when input dot has next returns false, that means I've reached the end of my file, so I don't want to read anymore. So as long as input dot has next is true, I'm going to call input dot next line and read that line and store it into a string. I'm calling that string info here. And just for this program, I'm going to go ahead and print that info line out to show that I have read the line of the file from my data file. Once I've done that, I'm going to go back up and say, hey, are there still more lines to read? And if there are, I'm going to keep looping over and over again, reading a line from the text file and printing it out as I go through my data file itself. At the very end, I am going to call input.close to close out my scanner. All right, let's run this program and see what we get. Here we go. Notice it's printing out every single line of data that it got from the file. It prints out number one, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Number two, Stanford University. Number two, University of California is a tie for number two. Four, Princeton University. And it read out each line, and that entire long line of data it printed, and the code runs all the way down to we get to number 489, 490s, and then 498 is the last line of data that I have in that data file. Great. So I've read from the file and I've printed out the contents. But now, how can I create those college objects, right? I have a line of data, but now that we have that line of data, can we convert it into an object itself? How do we do that? Well, go back to the Java quick reference. You have a method on there called the split method in the string class. And what this does is it takes a string and the split method will return an array of strings where each element of that array is a substring of the string object itself. And it's going to split it up looking for whatever that del parameter is. Well, in this case, we know that our file, our data file, is a comma separated value file. So we know that all of the elements are separated by commas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string array called values. And I'm going to call info. Remember, info was the line of data that I read from the file, right? I'm going to call info.split and send it in quotes a comma. So it knows that it's going to split info up into individual elements that are separated by the commas in that line of data. And it will put them into a brand new array of strings that it's going to return. And I'm going to store it in my values variable, which is an array of strings. And then once that happens, I can use the individual elements of that array to construct our college object. So let's look at the code. It looks like this. Here, this is in the middle of that while loop, right? While input.hasNext. Remember, I read that input line, and then here I take info and I say string bracket values equals info.split, and I send it that comma. So now values is an array of all of the elements in that line of data. Now, we know the format of that data file. We know there are 16 attributes for each institution listed, for each line of data. So what I can do is I can create, and I didn't have to create local variables. I could have used this in the constructor itself, but I went ahead and created 16 local variables that I know the order of because I know the format of that data. And I assigned each element of my array to one of those local variables. Now, hold on. Some of you eagle-eyed coders might have noticed there's a problem here. Good catch. We'll get to that in a moment. But because I know there are 16 values in the array, because each line has 16 data points about my institution, you'll notice that I started from value 0 all the way down to values 15, which is the last element of that array. And I assigned each one of those to all my local variables. Finally, I'm going to construct a college object. It's called it C for now, equals new college. And I sent as arguments to my constructor all 16 variables that I created from the values within that array. So let's run this program. Oh, what happened? It won't even compile, let alone run. Notice I've got a whole bunch of incompatible data types. String cannot be converted to int, string cannot be converted to double. What happened here? Let's go back to the code. Do you see the problem? Let's look at these lines in particular. These are where I have my integer and double local variables because those are the values that I want to read about or that I want to load into my college object, right? The rank is an integer, the student to faculty ratio is a double, but I have an array of strings. So how can I take that array of strings and store them into integer variables or double variables? That's going to be a problem. That's going to be something that we look at in our next video. So in this video, we discussed reading from values from a text file, specifically a CSV file. And we also explored how to use the string method split to break up our data into usable parts. But we do have a problem. We have mismatched data types. That's something that we're going to have to solve in our next video. All right, that's it for us here today. Thanks so much for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time. Take care.